The morning Sallie Alden rode into Dusty Creek, Texas. In the spring of 1882, she carried nothing but a leather satchel full of brushes, 3 folded canvases, and a stubborn belief that a woman with paint in her veins could make a living anywhere in the American West. She had come from St. Louis, not fleeing anything exactly, but certainly chasing something, the kind of freedom that polite Eastern society wrapped in a corset, and a set of rules she had never been able to follow with any genuine conviction. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with hands perpetually stained at the knuckles from cadmium yellow and Prussian blue, and she had a way of looking at a person that made them feel simultaneously seen and studied, which unsettled most men and charmed a surprising few. Dusty Creek was a cattle town, the kind that had sprung up along the rail line after the war and grown just fast enough to have a proper main street, but not fast enough to have any real pretension about it. There was a saloon, a dry goods store, a livery, a telegraph office, a church whose white paint was already peeling in the merciless Texas sun, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Gracie Fitch, who charged $1 a week and asked no questions so long as her guests were quiet after 9 o'clock and did not bring spirits into the rooms. Sallie secured a room before the afternoon heat had properly set in, unpacked her brushes with the same careful attention another woman might give to fine china, and went down to the saloon not to drink, but because the bartender, a large, friendly man named Pete Dunbar, had been pointed out to her by Mrs. Fitch as someone who knew everyone in the county and everything that happened in it. "I am looking for work," Sallie told him directly, setting her portfolio of sample portraits on the bar counter and spreading them out with practiced efficiency. "I paint portraits, good ones. I have painted judges and merchants and a riverboat captain's wife who cried when she saw the finished piece, and not from disappointment." Pete Dunbar wiped the counter with a cloth and leaned over to study her samples. He was quiet for a long moment, which Sallie had learned to take as a good sign. Dismissal came quickly. Consideration took time. "There's one man in this county who might hire you for something like that," Pete said at last. "Oliver Merritt." Sallie wrote the name in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. "Tell me about him." Pete settled back against the shelves behind the bar with the comfortable posture of a man who enjoyed telling stories. Oliver Merritt, he explained, was the owner of the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, the Redstone Ranch, named for the particular clay-red color of the soil on his eastern pastures. He had come to Texas from Virginia 12 years ago, at 20 years of age, with a horse, $100 borrowed from a distant uncle, and what Pete described with obvious admiration as a particular kind of hard-headedness that the land either breaks or rewards. The land had rewarded him. He was 32 now, Pete continued. He ran a respected operation, paid his hands fairly, kept his accounts honest, and was known throughout the county as a man whose word, once given, was iron. He had never married, a fact that caused considerable speculation among the women of Dusty Creek and several surrounding towns, though Pete offered no further theory on the subject beyond a vague gesture that suggested it was none of his business. What was relevant, Pete said, was that Oliver Merritt's mother had died the previous winter back in Virginia, and she had taken with her the only existing portrait of Oliver's father, a man who had died when Oliver was 7, and whom Oliver had, by all accounts, never properly grieved because there had always been too much work to do. There was a rumor, Pete lowered his voice as though sharing something of actual importance, that Oliver had been quietly asking around for a portrait painter. "Not just any painter, a good one. You think he would meet with me?" Sallie asked. "Couldn't say for certain," Pete admitted. "He comes into town most Saturdays. But if you want my honest opinion, I'd ride out to the ranch and ask him yourself. Oliver Merritt respects people who come straight at a thing." Sallie thanked him, ordered a lemonade, drank it thoughtfully, and decided she would ride out to Redstone Ranch the following morning. She borrowed a horse from the livery, A steady brown mare named Clara who seemed to share Sally's no-nonsense approach to the world, and set out at first light with her portfolio strapped to the saddle and her hat pulled down against the rising sun. The ranch was 7 miles east of town, and the ride took her across a landscape that shifted from the dry scrub near town into something greener and more dramatic as the land rose slightly, and the red soil Pete had mentioned began to show at the edges of the track, vivid as rust against the pale grass. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, the deep animal warmth of cattle, the wood smoke of a cook fire, the particular dusty sweetness of a working operation that had been built with intention. Then the house came into view, and it surprised her. She had expected something rough, a working man's structure thrown up quickly and not much attended to since. What she found instead was a long, low ranch house built from timber and local stone, with a wide covered porch running the full length of the front, a kitchen garden to the side that someone clearly tended with real care, and window boxes with geraniums in them that she would not have predicted in 100 guesses. A man was working near the fence of the near corral, and even at a distance, there was something about the way he moved that made her slow the mare without consciously deciding to do so. He was tall, with the particular lean build of someone who worked hard enough and regularly enough that there was simply no excess left on him. He wore a worn brown hat, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and boots that had seen significant use. He was working on a section of fence post with a methodical efficiency that suggested the task had his full attention, though he looked up at the sound of her approach before she had expected him to. His face, she thought immediately and involuntarily, was interesting. Not beautiful in the classical sense she was trained to reproduce, not symmetrical in the easy way that made a painter's job simple, but interesting, which was always better. There was a directness in his dark eyes that matched what Pete had told her, a jaw that suggested a stubborn streak and something around the mouth that she could not immediately categorize but that struck her as relevant. He set down his fence tool as she drew the mare to a stop. "Morning," he said, and his voice was even and unhurried. "Can I help you?" "I am looking for Oliver Merritt," Sally said. "You found him." She climbed down from the mare with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to manage horses without assistance and turned to face him properly. "My name is Sallie Alden. I am a portrait painter, and I have been told you may be looking for someone with my skills. I have brought samples of my work, and I would appreciate the chance to show them to you if you have a few minutes to spare." Oliver Merritt studied her for a moment with those direct, dark eyes. It was not an unfriendly look. It was the look of a man who was accustomed to making assessments quickly and accurately because his daily life required it. "I have a few minutes," he said. "Come up to the porch." She untied the portfolio from the saddle and followed him. He waited for her at the porch steps, which she noted, and held the gate of the small picket fence that separated the yard from the porch steps, which she also noted but did not remark on. He studied her samples seriously and in silence for what felt like several minutes but was probably closer to 4. She had learned not to fill silences like this one with explanations or justifications. The work spoke or it did not. "These are very good," he said at last, and his tone was factual, not flattering. "That was better. Thank you. I trained under a portraitist in St. Louis for 3 years and have been working independently for 2. He looked at her then with a slightly different quality of attention. "You came all the way out here from St. Louis." "I did." "Why?" It was a direct question, and she gave him a direct answer. "Because the West is full of people who have stories worth capturing and not enough artists paying attention, and because I prefer open sky to parlor ceilings." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the possibility of one. "What's your commission?" She named a figure that was fair, neither cheap enough to suggest she doubted her own work nor extravagant enough to suggest she was taking advantage. She had thought carefully about this on the ride out. He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "I want a portrait of my father. I have one photograph. It is old and the light is poor, but it is all I have." I want something I can put on the wall of this house, something that looks like a man and not a ghost." "I can do that," Sallie said. "May I see the photograph?" He went inside and returned with a small, faded photograph in a tarnished frame. The man in it was standing very straight in what appeared to be a suit, looking at the camera with an expression of serious purpose. Even through the age and the poor exposure, she could see the resemblance to the man standing before her, the set of the jaw, the directness of the gaze. "I will need to work from this and from what you can tell me about him," she said. "The more you tell me, the more I can give you beyond what the photograph shows." He looked at her for a moment. "What kind of things do you mean? Was he a man who laughed easily or rarely? Did he work with his hands? Was he someone who looked comfortable indoors or who seemed like he belonged outside? Small things matter. They change what I reach for." Oliver was quiet for a moment. He worked his hands to the bone until they took him. He laughed not often, but when he did it was the kind you remembered. He liked to watch thunderstorms. Would stand on the porch and watch them come in for the whole duration. Sallie wrote this in her notebook, quickly and without comment, but she felt the weight of what he had said. A man describing a father he had barely known and had spent 25 years missing without perhaps allowing himself to call it that. "I will need several sessions," she told him, "and I would appreciate the use of a space with good north-facing light if you have one." He showed her to a room off the main hall that had clearly been used as a study. One window faced north, catching the clear, directionless light that painters preferred. There was a sturdy table, several chairs, and wall space enough to pin a canvas. They agreed on a schedule. She would ride out 3 mornings a week, and he would make the photograph and his time available to her during those mornings. She rode back to town with the arrangement settled, and the early sensation, familiar to her from years of work, of a project that would be meaningful. But there was something else beneath that familiar feeling, something she did not examine yet, something that had to do with the way he had described his father standing on the porch watching thunderstorms come in. She set up in the study on her first official working morning 2 days later, arranging her materials with the focused pleasure she always took in this preparatory stage. Oliver came in at the agreed time, 8 o'clock, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the organized spread of brushes and pigments and the bare canvas with what she could only describe as cautious curiosity. "You can sit," she told him. "I am going to begin with some preliminary sketches today. You do not need to pose or be still. Just be here." He sat in the chair across the table from where she had set up, and she began to sketch, not the photograph, but him, because she needed to understand the structure before she could translate it into the image of another person. This was her method, and she had not been asked to explain it yet. He sketched quickly, looking up frequently, and he watched her work with an expression of contained interest. After a few minutes of silence, he said, "May I ask you something?" "You may ask," she said, without looking up from the paper. "Why portraits? Of all the things a painter could paint?" She considered the question genuinely before answering. "Because people are the most complicated landscape there is. You can paint a mountain and the mountain will not have anything to say about whether you have gotten it right. A person knows, even if they cannot articulate it, whether you have seen them." He was quiet for a moment. "And you like to see people." "I think I need to," she said. "I have always been that way." She looked up from the paper to check a line of his jaw and found him looking at her with that particular direct quality that she was already learning to expect from him. Their eyes held for a moment longer than the exchange required, and she looked back down. She turned the first sketch toward him after another 20 minutes of work. It was quick, a study of his face in 3/4 profile, meant only for her reference. But she could see immediately that it had surprised him. "That is what I look like," he said, and she recognized in his voice the particular tone of someone encountering a precise reflection for perhaps the first time. "More or less," she said. "I see your father in it." He looked at the photograph on the table between them, then back at the sketch, and did not say anything for a moment. "You see that already? The jaw, the way the brow sets, Some of it is the photograph and some of it is what you told me about him." She paused. "You were 7 when he died." "Yes." She did not say she was sorry, because she could tell he had been told he was sorry many times, and it had not helped with the particular quality of the absence he carried. She just nodded and began a new sketch. By the end of that first session, she had 6 preliminary drawings pinned along the wall of the study, and Oliver Merritt stood looking at them with his arms crossed and his hat in his hand. She began transferring the first broad lines of the portrait composition to the canvas, the posture of his father, informed by the photograph, softened slightly by what he had told her, and Oliver watched her work with his full attention. "You do not paint like I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Something more careful, more hesitant." "Hesitation shows in the finished work," she said. "You commit to the line or you do not." He smiled at that, a real smile, brief and genuine, and she felt it the way she sometimes felt the start of a storm before the weather had shifted, something electric and distant and coming closer. She rode back to Mrs. Fitch's boarding house that evening with paint on her fingers and her thoughts in an unusual state of pleasant disorder. On her second visit, something unexpected happened. She had been working for perhaps an hour, building the underpainting of the portrait with careful, warm-toned glazes, when she heard a commotion outside, raised voices, and the particular clatter of horses arriving in a hurry. Oliver excused himself with a word and went out, and she followed after a moment, because she was curious by nature, and because the noise sounded like something that warranted attention. 2 of his ranch hands had come in hard from the north pasture, with news that a section of fence had come down in the previous night's wind and cattle had pushed through it onto the neighboring property land belonging to a man named Earl Hadley, who was known, Pete had mentioned to her at some point, as someone not inclined to patience about such things. Oliver was already issuing instructions before the men had finished speaking, pulling on his hat with one hand and calling to his foreman with the other. He turned briefly back to the porch where Sallie stood. "I am sorry," he said, with the genuine regret of someone who actually cared about the interruption. "This will take most of the day." "Do you need an extra hand?" she asked before she had quite decided to say it. He looked at her with something between surprise and amusement. "Can you ride?" "I rode 7 miles on a borrowed horse to get your business," she pointed out. "I think we have established that I can ride." The amusement won. "Then come if you want, but it will be muddy work and it will take most of the day." "I am not afraid of mud," she said, and went to change her smock for her riding coat. It did take most of the day. They rode north in a group of 5: Oliver, Sallie, his foreman a weathered man named Hank Dewitt, and 2 hands named Jimmy and Roy, and spent the morning rounding up the scattered cattle with a relentless efficiency that Sallie found genuinely impressive to observe. She was not useless, either. She had ridden enough in the Missouri countryside to know how to position a horse to turn a moving animal, and she did what she was told with a competence that she could see Oliver registering without comment. Earl Hadley appeared at midday, riding along his fence line with 2 of his own men and a face like a thunderhead. He was older than Oliver by perhaps 15 years, heavy-set and red-faced under his hat, and he spoke with the particular aggression of a man who preferred his grievances to their resolutions. "This is the second time in 2 years, Merritt," he said, pulling his horse to a stop in front of them. "My patience is considerable used up." "The fence came down in the wind," Oliver said, with a calm that was clearly a practiced response to Hadley's style of approach. "It is being fixed today. Every animal on your land is being returned, and I will send a man with compensation for any grass eaten." "It is the principle," Hadley said, and looked past Oliver to Sallie with an expression of unsubtle dismissal. "Who is this?" "Sallie Alden," Oliver said. "She is doing work for me." Hadley looked her up and down in a way that was rude without being subtle enough to properly accuse. "Odd kind of work to bring a woman along for." "She volunteered," Oliver said simply, and turned his horse back toward the fence work with the clean finality of a man ending a conversation that had already said everything useful it was going to say. Sallie followed him, and when they were out of Hadley's hearing she said, "He does not seem like a pleasant neighbor." "He is not," Oliver agreed. "But he is manageable as long as I do not give him genuine cause for complaint." He paused. "Thank you for coming out today. You were useful." "I generally try to be," she said. He looked at her sideways with that almost smile. "I have noticed." They ate lunch sitting on the tailgate of the supply wagon that Hank had brought out, cold biscuits and dried beef and coffee from a tin pot. And the ordinary, easy quality of it was something Sallie found herself appreciating in a way that had nothing to do with professional comfort. Oliver Merritt, she was discovering, was a man who made space for other people. He listened when his hand spoke, remembered the names of their wives and children, laughed at Jimmy's terrible jokes with the patient warmth of someone who genuinely did not think himself above the company he kept. She watched him, and she could not help it. That was the honest truth of it. She watched him the way she watched everything that interested her, with the full and unself-conscious attention of someone who had never learned to pretend she was not curious. On the ride back that afternoon, the sun going long and gold across the red soil, he pulled his horse alongside hers and said, without preamble, "You are not what I expected either." She glanced at him. "What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure. Someone more contained, I suppose. Someone who would stay in the study and not volunteer to chase cattle through creek mud. I find that staying in any one place too long is bad for the imagination," she said. "Besides, your father sounds like someone who understood that you have to go out and see things to understand them. I thought the work would benefit from my seeing how this land actually operates." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think a lot about the work. I think about a lot of things." "What else?" The question was simple and direct, and somehow it opened something in the conversation that had not been opened before. They rode for the next hour and talked, really talked, in the way that happens rarely and is recognized immediately when it does, the kind of exchange where neither person is performing or managing an impression, but is simply speaking from somewhere genuine. She told him about St. Louis and her training, and the mentor who had been brilliant and exacting, and had died of a fever 3 years ago, leaving her the full use of his studio, and the strong implication that she should go out into the world and do something worth doing. He told her about coming to Texas at 20 with nothing and the first brutal winter, and the gradually accumulating years of building something out of land and labor and stubbornness. She did not paint that day, but she felt, riding back to town in the fading light with red mud on her boots and a pleasant ache in her legs from the long hours in the saddle, that she had learned more about the man she was working for than she could have learned in a week of studio sessions. The portrait was progressing. She built it up in careful layers the way she had been trained. The warm underpaint first, then the deep tone work in the shadow areas, the slow accumulation of color and form that would eventually coalesce into something that looked like a man rather than a collection of carefully applied pigment. She worked from the photograph and from Oliver's descriptions, and from the growing sense she had of the family that connected them. The straight back, the direct gaze, the jaw that suggested the same combination of stubbornness and integrity that she was coming to know in the son. Oliver came to observe her work on most mornings, sitting in the study and either reading his correspondence or watching her work with a steady, unobtrusive attention that she found, somewhat to her surprise, not disruptive at all. Most people, when they watched her work, generated a kind of nervous energy that interfered with her concentration. Oliver simply sat, companionably present, and the room was comfortable for it. They talked during these sessions, more and more as the days passed. About his father's years in Virginia before the war, and what he could recall of them from the stories his mother had told him. About the specific challenges of running a cattle operation in this part of Texas in this particular decade. The drought of 1879 that he described with the careful understatement of someone who had survived it by a narrow margin. The gradual enclosure of open-range land by barbed wire fencing, which he saw as both inevitable and deeply complicated. The railroad's reach, and what it was doing to towns like Dusty Creek, growing them quickly in ways that were not always improvements. She told him about the communities she had passed through on her way west, the boomtowns that bloomed and emptied like seasonal flowers, the homesteaders who arrived with enormous hope and faced conditions that tested everything they had brought with them. She told him about the people she had painted, the minister's wife in Kansas City, who had shown her a profound and quiet dignity that she had tried to capture in the portrait and felt she had perhaps half succeeded at. The retired cavalry officer in Abilene who had wept silently when he saw his finished portrait, though he had said it was dust in his eyes and she had not contradicted him. "You see people clearly," Oliver said one morning, looking up from his correspondence while she worked. "It is a gift, but I imagine it costs something." She paused her brush. "What do you mean?" "I mean that seeing people, really seeing them, means you also see the harder things, the things they are hiding or have not resolved or cannot say. That has to be a weight." She looked at him, genuinely surprised that he had articulated this, because it was true and she had never heard anyone put it in exactly that way. "Yes," she said, "it does, but the alternative would be to look at surfaces, and I think I would wither doing that." He held her gaze for a moment. The morning light came through the north window and lay across the studio in that clear, beautiful way that she loved, and he was sitting in it, and she was very aware, suddenly, of the fact that she had been looking at him every morning for 2 weeks, and that this was no longer purely professional attention. She looked back at the canvas. That afternoon she rode into town and went directly to Pete Dunbar's saloon and ordered a lemonade and sat at the far end of the bar and thought carefully and honestly about the situation she was in. She was 24 years old. She was an independent woman in the year 1882, which meant she had fought for every piece of that independence with deliberate effort and was not inclined to do anything careless with it. She was in the middle of a commission that she intended to complete with the same professional integrity she brought to all her work. And she was, with a certainty that she could not argue herself out of, developing feelings for the man who had commissioned it. She did not panic about this because panicking was not her nature, but she did think about it with the same honest rigor that she brought to every other problem. She thought about the professional implications. She thought about the personal ones. She thought about the fact that Oliver Merritt had given no clear indication that his interest in her extended beyond the genuine warmth of someone who had found an unexpected and compatible mind in an unexpected place. And then she thought about the way he had looked at her when she had ridden back into his yard after chasing his cattle through the creek mud, his expression containing something that she, as a trained observer of human faces, had recognized, and that had not been simple admiration for her riding ability. She finished her lemonade and went back to the boarding house and started a new sketch, not of his father and not of him, but of the red soil pasture land as she had seen it from horseback in the long afternoon light, because she needed to put something true on paper, and that was the truest thing she could access at the moment. Mrs. Fitch knocked on her door that evening with a small plate of apple cake and a knowing look that Sallie did not invite comment on but could not entirely resist. "You are going out to the Merritt ranch again tomorrow," the older woman said, setting the cake on the table. "I am. The portrait is progressing well." "Is it?" said Mrs. Fitch, in a tone that suggested she was not specifically referring to the portrait. "Good night, Mrs. Fitch," Sallie said, and Mrs. Fitch left with the dignified composure of someone who has made her point and is content to let it settle. The portrait was, in fact, progressing beautifully. She had moved past the broad structure into the finer work, the particular quality of light in a man's eyes, the softness that appears at the corners of the mouth when a face is in repose, the specific way a collar sits against a neck. She was painting a man she had never met from a faded photograph and a collection of memories offered to her by his son, and she was beginning to feel that she knew him, not as well as she would know a living subject, but in the particular way you come to know someone through the accounts of the person who loved them most and missed them deepest. Oliver came in one morning and stood looking at the canvas for a long time before he said anything. "That is him," he said finally. "That is actually him." His voice was different in that moment, lower, more careful, the voice of a man allowing himself to feel something he generally kept under firm management. Sallie did not look at him because she recognized the quality of the moment and understood that people needed privacy within their emotions even when someone else was present. "I am glad," she said quietly. "How did you—" He stopped. "How did you know the eyes? The photograph barely shows them." "You told me he liked to watch thunderstorms come in," she said. "That is a particular kind of person, someone who is not afraid of large things, someone who finds them worth stopping for. That is what I put in the eyes." He did not say anything for another minute. Then he said, "You are remarkable, Sallie." He had been calling her Sallie for about a week, and she had been calling him Oliver, the formality having dissolved naturally somewhere around the fifth or sixth morning of conversation. But he had said her name differently just now, with a weight to it that was different from the comfortable, habitual use of the previous days. She finally turned to look at him. He was still looking at the portrait, but then he looked at her, and the directness of his gaze in that moment was something that she felt physically, like the first warmth of the sun after a cold morning. "I am glad it is right," she said, because she needed to say something practical before she said something she had not yet decided whether to say. He seemed to understand this, because he nodded and looked back at the portrait, and the charged quality of the moment shifted, not disappearing entirely but settling into something more manageable. But something had changed. They both knew it. The following Saturday, Oliver drove into town in his wagon on his regular supply run, and they happened to meet on the main street. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a packet of new charcoal pencils, and he was tying up his wagon in front of the hardware store, and the easy pleasure of the encounter, the way they both stopped and smiled without any professional context to organize the exchange, made it plain to both of them that this was no longer simply a working relationship. He asked if she had eaten, and she had not, and they went to the eating house on the main street, a decent place run by a woman named Mrs. Torres, whose tamales had become locally legendary among the ranch hands who came into town on weekends, and they sat across from each other in the small, busy room and ate together, for the first time outside of tailgates and cold biscuits. It was different in this setting, more deliberate, and they both knew it and were both, she thought, somewhat at a loss for how to navigate it without losing the easy naturalness of what they had built. She found herself grateful when he simply picked up a thread of conversation as though they were still in the study, asking her what she intended to do when the portrait was finished, whether she planned to stay in the territory or move on to the next commission. "I do not have a next commission yet," she said. "I have been reaching out through correspondence to several newspapers in Austin and San Antonio about placing an advertisement, but nothing has materialized." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You would consider staying in this area?" It was very nearly a question. "I would consider it," she said carefully, "if there were reasons to." He looked at her over the coffee cup with those direct, dark eyes. "I would like there to be reasons," he said, and it was so simple and so honest and so entirely characteristic of him that she felt something in her chest that she had no professional category for at all. "Oliver," she said. "I know," he said. "I am aware we are in the middle of a commission, and you are a professional, which I respect enormously. I did not intend to make the situation complicated." "You have not made it complicated," she said, because it was true. "It simply is complicated, or rather it is not complicated, it is just significant, which is different." He looked at her with something that might have been relief. "That is a very good distinction. I make them occasionally." He smiled, and it was one of the full ones, not the careful almost ones she had been cataloging for weeks, and she was glad she was sitting down. They walked out of the eating house into the bright Saturday afternoon of Dusty Creek's Main Street, with the busy Saturday commerce around them, and the noise of the saloon and the children chasing each other between the storefronts and the distant lowing of cattle at the edge of the stockyard. And it was all very ordinary and very vivid, and Sallie felt very specifically present in it. Oliver said, "Would you walk with me?" She walked with him to the end of the main street, and then along the smaller lane that led out toward the edge of town, where there was a wooden bridge over the creek that gave the town its name. The creek was running with the spring rains, clear and quick over its stony bed, and they stood on the bridge and he told her about the first time he had seen this place, 12 years ago, riding through on his way south and farther west and stopping at this creek to water his horse, and feeling, for the first time since he had left Virginia, something that he had not immediately recognized as the sensation of belonging. "Why here?" she asked. "I could not fully explain it then, and I still cannot," he said. "Something about the light, maybe, the particular quality of it in the afternoon, and the fact that the land had good grass and the creek was reliable and there was enough timber in the hills to the north for building." He paused. "And something that had nothing to do with any of that and that I have never tried to put into words." She was leaning on the bridge rail looking down at the water, and she said, without looking at him, "Sometimes knowing something is right does not require knowing why." "You believe that?" he asked. "You seem like someone who examines things carefully." "I examine everything carefully," she said. "That is how I know that some things are simply real and do not require additional justification." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have been thinking about you a great deal, Sallie. Not I have been thinking about this, what this is, what I would like it to be if you were willing." She turned to look at him. "And what would you like it to be?" The afternoon light was on his face, the same light she had been studying every morning for weeks, and she knew every plane and angle of it by now, and she found that she had not grown accustomed to it in the way that familiarity usually works. It was still compelling, more compelling, if anything, than it had been at the beginning. "I would like to know you," he said, "properly, outside of the studio and the commission. I would like to take you out to see the east pasture in the early morning when the light on the red soil is something that even I, who am not a painter, think is worth looking at. I would like to take you to the cattle auction in Abilene next month, which is not a romantic proposition exactly, but I think you would find it interesting and I would like your company for the ride." He paused. "I would like to sit across from you at a table for longer than it takes to eat a meal, on a regular basis, for a significant period of time." Sallie looked at him for a moment. "That is a very specific accounting of what you want. I find it is better to be specific." "It is," she agreed. "I would like all of those things as well." Something settled in his expression, a relief that was deeper than the situation strictly required, which told her things about what this had cost him to say. He reached across the bridge rail and took her hand carefully, as though it was something he was choosing rather than acting on impulse, and she let him, and they stood on the wooden bridge over Dusty Creek with the spring water running quick below them, and the afternoon going gold all around them, and it was simple and momentous at once. The portrait was not finished. She had perhaps 3 sessions left of real work: the final glazes, the refinement of the light source, the varnish that would seal everything and bring up the depth of color. She worked on it with what she recognized was a slight bittersweet quality, because finishing the commission meant the formal reason for coming to Redstone Ranch every morning would be gone, and she would have to find her way in the new reality of what was between them without the scaffold of the professional arrangement. But before the portrait was finished, something happened that clarified everything in an unexpected way. She arrived at the ranch one morning to find it in an unusual state of contained tension. Hank Dewitt met her at the gate with a tight expression and told her that there had been trouble in the night. Someone had cut a significant section of fence on the south side of the property, and 3 of the ranch's prize breeding bulls had gone missing. She found Oliver at the south fence line with 2 of his hands, examining the cut wire with the controlled expression of a man keeping his temper on a very short leash. "Was it Hadley?" she asked, without preamble. He looked at her. The timing and the location suggest it, but I cannot prove it. What are you going to do? I am going to ride to his property and ask him directly if he has seen my bulls. He said it with a calm that she recognized now as his particular form of iron self-control. And then I am going to go to the county sheriff and file a report. I will come with you, she said. Sallie, I will not be useful at all times, she said firmly. But if there is a dispute that may affect your livelihood and I can serve as an additional witness, then I would like to be there. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to know well, the one that crossed his face when she surprised him by being exactly who she was in a situation where he had, perhaps, expected her to be less. Then he nodded. They rode to Earl Hadley's property with Hank Dewitt and one of the hands. Hadley met them in his yard with an expression of studied innocence that Sallie found transparently unconvincing. But Oliver handled the exchange with a diplomatic precision that she admired, clear, direct, without accusation, but without submission. He stated what had happened, stated what was missing, stated that the sheriff would be informed, and observed that if any strayed animals had ended up on Hadley's property, an expedient return would be to everyone's benefit. Hadley denied knowing anything, with the practiced air of a man who had denied things before. But as they turned to go, Sallie said quietly to Oliver, "The track along his eastern barn. The mud is churned up in a particular way." Oliver glanced at her. "3 large animals make a specific pattern," she said. "I have been looking at tracks all spring. The mud by his eastern barn has been very recently disturbed." Oliver looked at Hadley. "I would like to look at your eastern barn." Hadley's face did what guilty faces do under pressure. "You have no right, then I will bring the sheriff back with me," Oliver said simply. "Your choice." There was a long, ugly silence. Then Hadley called to his man to open the barn gate, with the deflated fury of someone who has lost the play and knows it. The 3 bulls were in the barn. The sheriff was summoned. The appropriate reports were filed. The animals were returned, and Earl Hadley spent the following weeks in a legal difficulty that resolved itself without going to court, but that cost him considerably in fines and neighborly reputation. Oliver did not gloat about this, which was one of the things Sallie most respected about him. He simply said, when it was resolved, that he hoped the matter was settled and that he had no interest in perpetuating a conflict with his neighbor. What he said to Sallie privately was, "You saw those tracks." "I was looking," she said. "You are always looking." "That is my nature," she said. "I thought we had established this." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that she had come to collect like something precious, and reached for her hand as naturally as breathing. The portrait was finished on a Thursday morning in late May. She had been working on the final details since first light, and Oliver had come in at 8 as usual and sat reading while she worked, glancing up periodically to watch her progress. She was aware of him watching and aware of the approaching completion, with a feeling she could not entirely separate into its professional and personal components. She set down her finest brush at approximately 10 o'clock and stepped back from the canvas with the particular interior sensation she always felt at a completion, not relief exactly, but a kind of stillness, a moment of assessment before the verdict. Oliver had looked up from his reading and was watching her face. "It is done?" he asked. "It is done," she said. He came to stand beside her and they looked at the portrait together. The man in it was straight-backed and strong-jawed, with eyes that contained the particular combination of warmth and steadiness that she had constructed from a faded photograph and a son's grief, and a detail about a man who liked to watch thunderstorms. He looked like someone who had worked hard and loved his family and been taken too soon, and who was nevertheless, somehow, still present. Oliver did not say anything for a long time. She stood beside him and did not speak either and gave him the privacy of the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough at the edges. "It is exactly right," he said. "It is better than I knew to hope for." "He was worth getting right," she said. He turned to look at her and there were tears in his eyes, which he did not attempt to hide or explain, and she understood then with complete clarity what it had cost him to commission this portrait, to open a grief he had been managing alone for 25 years, and to trust her with it. "Thank you," he said. "Sallie, thank you." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the jaw she had sketched so many times in the past weeks, the jaw that looked so much like his father's in the portrait, and he closed his hand over hers and held it there. And the morning light came through the north window and lay across the finished portrait and across both of them. And it was a moment she knew she would remember with the precision she reserved for things that were entirely real. He kissed her then, carefully, and with the same quality of conscious deliberateness he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the directness that was her own nature, and it was exactly right in the way that some things simply are. She stayed at Redstone Ranch for dinner that evening, eating at the long kitchen table with Oliver and Hank Dewitt, and three of the hands in the easy, boisterous atmosphere of a working ranch supper. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, the specific sensation of being somewhere she was supposed to be. The summer unfolded with a richness that she had not anticipated when she rode into Dusty Creek on a borrowed horse with a leather satchel full of brushes and a set of convictions about open sky. She took Oliver up on his offer to show her the east pasture in the early morning, and the light on the red soil was, as he had said, extraordinary of vivid, almost theatrical warmth that made her want to paint it immediately, and also simply stand in it for a long moment doing nothing except looking. She set up her easel out there on 2 separate mornings and produced 2 small landscapes that she considered, privately, among the best work she had ever done. She rode with him to Abilene for the cattle auction in June, which was exactly as interesting as he had predicted and considerably louder. A roaring, chaotic spectacle of animals and commerce, and competing voices that she found genuinely thrilling from a documentary perspective. She filled 6 pages of her sketchbook during the 2-day event with quick studies of faces and animals, and the particular drama of men and commerce conducted in a dusty outdoor ring. And Oliver watched her work during the quieter moments with a warm, admiring attention that she was no longer pretending not to notice. They stayed 2 nights in Abilene, at a respectable hotel, in separate rooms, all entirely proper, and ate dinner together both evenings at a restaurant near the stockyards that served excellent beef, which Sallie pointed out was almost certainly not a coincidence given the clientele. On the second evening, walking back to the hotel through the Abilene streets in the warm June night with the cattle town alive around them and the stars enormous overhead, Oliver said, without any preamble at all, "I love you, Sallie." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her with the honest directness that was so entirely himself. "I have been thinking about the right moment to say that," he said. "And then I realized that looking for the right moment is probably a way of avoiding saying something real, so I thought I should simply say it." She looked at him in the lamplight that fell from a nearby doorway, this man who had let her see his grief and his land and his everyday life and his full, unguarded laugh, this man who had taken her hand on a bridge and kissed her in a room full of north-facing light, and driven 7 miles each way to have supper with her in town twice a week all through May. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have since before I finished the first sketch." He put his arm around her, and they stood in the Abilene street with the warm night all around them, and it was exactly as uncomplicated as something significant can be. She had, in the weeks since the portrait's completion, been corresponding with a newspaper in San Antonio about an editorial commission, a series of portrait sketches of notable Texans to accompany a feature piece, and it had developed to the point where she had an actual offer in her hand, 3 months of work, a fair fee, and the use of a studio space. It was a good opportunity. It was exactly the kind of thing she had come west to find. She told Oliver about it in August, sitting on the Redstone Ranch porch in the long evening light. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a significant opportunity." "It is. You should take it." She looked at him. 3 months is a long time. "It is not forever," he said, "and this is what you do. It would be wrong of me to wish you to set it aside." She studied his face. "You would not ask me to stay." "I would not ask you to diminish yourself to stay," he said carefully. "That is different from wanting you to stay, which I do very much, and from believing that there is something here worth coming back to, which I believe with everything I have." She reached across the porch rail and took his hand. "3 months and then I come back." 3 months and then you come back," he agreed, "and we will talk properly about what comes after that if you are willing." She was willing. She rode to San Antonio in September with her brushes and her canvases, and a heart that was in Texas even when she was 300 miles south of it. And she worked hard and well for 3 months, painting 11 distinguished Texans whose portraits appeared in the San Antonio Express to considerable admiring response. And she wrote to Oliver twice a week and received his letters in return. Letters that were direct and factual and occasionally revelatory in the way that letters sometimes manage to be, laying out the interior of a person in ways that face-to-face conversation does not always reach. He wrote her about the early morning quality of the light on the east pasture and knew, she thought, exactly what he was doing. He wrote her about Hank Dewitt's new border collie puppy and the chaos it had introduced into the operation of the ranch and the way he had found himself laughing at it every morning. He wrote her about riding out to the North Hills in the first cold of autumn and watching a storm come in over the red soil country and thinking about his father, and about the portrait on the wall of the hallway that he had come to sit in front of occasionally in the evening, not in grief now, but in something more like conversation. She wrote him about the people she was painting and what she saw in them. She wrote him about San Antonio, a city that was more complex and layered than she had expected, where Mexican and Anglo and German communities existed in a proximity that produced something vital and sometimes tense, and always interesting. She wrote him about the dusk on the San Antonio River and how it made her want to paint water, which she had never particularly wanted to do before. She wrote him about the fact that she had found, in the weeks since the night in Abilene, a kind of interior ease that she had not realized she was missing. She came back to Dusty Creek in December. He was waiting at the livery when she came in on the afternoon stage, which she had not expected, and she came around the corner of the livery building with her bags and her satchel and her portfolio, and found him standing there with his hat in his hand and an expression that was trying to be contained and was not quite succeeding. And she put everything she was carrying down on the ground and walked directly into his arms with the same directness she applied to everything. And he held her with a completeness that made the 3 months feel both very long and entirely worth the waiting. He took her to dinner at the eating house where they had first eaten together, and Mrs. Torres brought tamales and a look of satisfied approval that Sallie suspected had been constructed in advance. Half the town seemed to know she had returned, which in a town the size of Dusty Creek was not surprising, and in this instance she found she did not mind at all. After dinner, in the cold December night with the stars laid out brilliant overhead, Oliver walked with her to the wooden bridge over the creek, their bridge. She had begun privately to think of it, and the water was low with the winter dryness and the cold, and it moved quietly over its stones, and he stopped in the middle of the bridge and took both her hands. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him, the winter starlight on his face, the same face she had first sketched with professional intention, and had since come to know the way you know a landscape you have lived in, not because you have catalogued it, but because it has become part of the way you see. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to ask you to bring your brushes and your easel and your north-facing light requirements to Redstone Ranch on a permanent basis. I want to build you a proper studio with the right windows. I want to ride out with you to the east pasture in the morning and watch you paint things worth painting. I want to watch thunderstorms come in from the porch with you for the rest of my life." He paused, and something gentler came into his voice. "And I want you to know that I am asking this knowing you are a full person with work that matters and places you need to go to do it. I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I am asking if who you are wants to come home to this. She had known, somewhere in the long arc of September and October and November, that this was coming. She had thought about it with the honest rigor she brought to things that mattered, and she had arrived at her answer before she boarded the stage back to Dusty Creek, which meant she had arrived at it without needing to be asked. "Yes," she said. "Oliver, yes." He put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band that she later learned he had ordered through the telegraph office in November, from a jeweler in San Antonio, while she was still there painting the notable Texans. And then he kissed her on their bridge with the Winter Creek running quiet below them and the cold, brilliant Texas stars overhead. And it was exactly the kind of thing that does not require explanation. They were married in February of 1883, in the little church on the main street of Dusty Creek with the peeling white paint, which someone had repainted for the occasion in a gesture of community warmth that Sallie found genuinely moving. Mrs. Fitch sat in the front pew and cried with the satisfied composure of someone who had seen this coming since the first week. Pete Dunbar attended and looked very pleased with himself, which was entirely justified. Hank Dewitt was Oliver's best man. Sallie's witness was a woman she had befriended in San Antonio during the commission, a painter named Rosa Vega, who had come up from San Antonio specifically for the occasion, and who spent 3 days at Redstone Ranch afterward, helping Sallie plan the studio that Oliver had promised to build. The studio was built in March, on the north side of the main house, with 3 windows of the correct orientation and a plank floor that would not be ruined by the inevitable paint spills, and a wide doorway that would accommodate large canvases. Oliver built much of it himself, with help from Hank in the hands, and Sallie painted a stripe of Prussian blue along the top of the interior wall when it was complete, which Oliver looked at with an expression of bemused affection and said, very seriously, that he thought it improved the room considerably. She set up her studio on a bright March morning and stood in it alone for a few minutes before she began to work, feeling the particular interior satisfaction of a space that was entirely and specifically hers in a place that was entirely and specifically home. Then she opened her paint box and set to work on a large landscape of the east pasture at dawn, the red soil and the long grass and the specific quality of the early light, working from the small study she had done the previous summer, and she did not stop until midday, when Oliver knocked at the studio door and announced that Hank had made coffee and that he had something to show her. What he had to show her was a section of the north fence line where, that morning, 3 mares had foaled, all 3 within the same few hours, which the hands were calling a good omen for the year. They walked out together through the cold March air to see the new foals standing on uncertain legs in the morning sunshine, and Sallie looked at them and then looked at Oliver beside her, and felt something that she had no formal category for, but that was very large and very warm and very specifically located in the middle of her chest. She told him that fall that she was expecting their child, on the porch in the September evening, with the sound of the hands finishing the day's work in the distance and the warmth of the lingering summer still in the air. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, and then he pulled her close with a gentleness that was different from anything she had seen from him before, careful and enormous, the way people hold things that are completely precious. Their son was born in April of 1884. They named him James, for Oliver's father, and from the first morning he was in the house, Oliver took to fatherhood with the same thorough, devoted attention he brought to everything he cared about, which was wholly unsurprising to Sallie and wholly wonderful. James was a red-haired, loud, cheerful baby who grew into an opinionated toddler, and then into a small boy who had his father's directness and his mother's relentless curiosity, and an absolute fascination with animals that expressed itself in a trail of small creatures. He insisted on housing in the barn field mice, an injured sparrow, a very small desert tortoise who was named Captain by James, and who proved to be a permanent and surprisingly companionable addition to the Redstone Ranch. Sallie's work continued. She took 3 more formal commissions in the years after James was born, one in Austin, one in Houston, and one that kept her in San Antonio for 6 weeks in 1886. And Oliver managed the ranch and James, and the general domestic requirements with a competence that owed a great deal to Mrs. Hattie Ford, a forthright woman from Georgia who came to help with the house and James, and who became one of the most important people in the life of the ranch. Each time Sallie came home from a commission, she came home to the same feeling, the one she had first noticed at the supper table with the Hands and Mrs. Fitch's knowing look and the weight of Oliver's hand over hers on the bridge, the feeling of a place that was simply and irrevocably hers. She painted the east pasture 4 more times over the following years, at different seasons and different hours, and the series of 5 landscapes hung together in the main room of the ranch house and constituted, she felt, the best work she had ever done and possibly would ever do, the thing she had come west to find, the complicated living landscape of the Texas frontier in a particular decade, caught in paint and light before the world moved on. She painted Oliver's portrait the year James turned 4. She had been resisting it for a long time, not from reluctance but from something more complex. The painter's uncertainty about the subject who is too close, the fear of knowing someone so well that the painting becomes about your own knowledge rather than the truth of the person. She had painted his face thousands of times in quick studies and notebooks and the margins of letters, but the formal portrait was a different undertaking. She worked on it over 3 months, mostly in the early mornings while James was still asleep, and Oliver came into the studio periodically to sit, and she would study him with professional intensity and then return to the work. He was patient with this in the way he was patient with everything, though once he said, when he had been sitting particularly still for a long time, that he now understood completely why portrait subjects throughout history had looked slightly dazed. When it was finished, she put it beside his father's portrait in the hallway, and they stood and looked at the 2 of them together, father and son, separated by 30 years and by the particular clarity of her attention. And Oliver put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the hallway was quiet and full of the warm late afternoon light that came through the window at the end of the passage. "You see me," he said. "I always have," she said. A daughter arrived in 1887 in October, all dark hair and enormous opinions from the very first days. They named her Clara, for the steady brown mare that Sallie had borrowed from the livery on the morning she rode out to Redstone Ranch with a portfolio and a conviction and nothing yet resolved, which seemed, Oliver said, like the right kind of honoring. Clara Merritt grew up between the studio and the barn and the east pasture, and proved, by the time she was 5, to be equally devoted to horses, and to the pigment boxes her mother let her use on dedicated afternoons when the studio was set aside for small hands and large ambitions. James grew taller than his father by the time he was 15 and retained his father's directness, and his mother's looking habit in a combination that made him, his teacher at the Dusty Creek schoolhouse said, the most interestingly observant student she had encountered in 20 years of teaching. The Redstone Ranch grew and prospered. Oliver expanded the south pasture in 1888 with a parcel of land he purchased from a retiring neighbor, not Hadley, who had sold his property the year before, and moved to El Paso in a circumstance that no one who knew him was surprised by, and the operation became one of the most respected in the region. He hired more hands and paid them honestly and ran the accounts with the same integrity that had always characterized everything he did, and the ranch was known throughout the county as a good place to work. The portrait of James Merritt Sr. hung in the hallway of the ranch house for the rest of Oliver's life. He brought it up sometimes in conversation, unexpectedly, in the way people do with things that have settled into them rather than remaining separate. He would mention his father when something reminded him, a storm coming in over the east pasture, a moment with James or Clara that illustrated something about inheritance. And Sallie would listen with the full attention she had always given him. And there was no longer the guarded quality of a man managing his grief, but simply the open quality of someone who has found a way to carry what they carry without it diminishing what they have. She asked him once, on a summer evening on the porch with the cattle distant and the stars beginning to show and James and Clara asleep inside, whether he had found what he had been looking for when he stopped at the creek 12 years before she arrived. He thought about it genuinely in the way he thought about things that deserved genuine consideration. "I found more than that," he said. "I think I did not know what I was looking for. I think I thought it was this." He gestured at the land, the porch, the house, and it was this, but it was not only this. "What was the rest of it?" she asked, though she thought she knew. He looked at her with those direct dark eyes that she had first encountered over a section of broken fence, and that she had been looking into for the better part of a decade, and that still had the capacity, in the right moment, to make her feel the way she had felt on the bridge in December with a ring on her finger and the winter stars overhead. "You know what the rest of it was," he said. "I do," she agreed. "But I wanted to hear you say it." He smiled, the full one, the good one, and reached for her hand on the porch rail in the summer dark. "It was you," he said. "It was always going to be you once you arrived." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the land they had built their life on, the red soil country of West Texas in the 1880s, in the middle of a decade, and a century, and a way of life that was already beginning to change in ways that no one could yet fully predict. The barbed wire was going up across the open range. The railroad was bringing more people and more complexity. The frontier was shifting, the wild and open thing being negotiated down into something more organized and less free. And there were real costs in that, costs that fell unevenly, that fell hardest on those who had lived here longest before the new arrivals came. She thought about this sometimes, the vast and complicated story that was happening all around their small and particular one. She thought about the Comanche peoples who had moved through this land for generations before any of them arrived. She thought about the Mexican families who had been here before Texas was Texas. She thought about the injustice of the way the land had been taken and divided and organized into ownership by people who had not been the first to call it home. These were not comfortable thoughts, and she did not think they were supposed to be, and she tried to hold them honestly alongside the genuine love she had for this place and this life, because that was what honesty required. She painted those thoughts sometimes, in work that was more difficult to sell and more important to make, a series of studies that tried to capture the full, complicated human presence on this landscape. Not just the ranchers and the townspeople, but the trace of everyone who had passed through and claimed and been displaced and survived. She showed these paintings to Oliver, who looked at them for a long time and said that they were the most important things she had ever made. She did not disagree. The East Pasture was still the first one, though. The 5 landscapes of the red soil and the changing light, the series she had begun in the studio he had built her in the March after their wedding. Those were the ground of everything, the first real thing she had made in this place, the declaration that she was staying, that this was where she was going to put her attention and her brush and her life. They had good years and difficult ones, as all lives contain. The drought of 1886 was brutal and cut deep into the ranch's margins, and Oliver worked through it with a grim, focused determination that cost him several years of apparent age but not a single step backward. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was the worst anyone in the county could remember, and they lost animals to it and income with them. And Sallie contributed to the recovery by completing a significant commercial commission she would not otherwise have taken, and they rebuilt together with the particular efficiency of 2 people who have established, over years of actual difficulty, that they are better together than they are separately. James left for university in Austin in 1902, which was a thing that Oliver watched with enormous pride and a few private tears that Sallie acknowledged only by handing him a handkerchief without comment. Clara followed 3 years later, determined to study law, which was not an obvious path for a young woman in 1905, but which was entirely consistent with everything she had been since approximately the age of 4. The ranch went on. Oliver went on, silver beginning to show at his temples, which Sallie painted with precise attention in a new portrait she did of him in 1899 when he was 49, not instead of the younger one but beside it, in a different room now, the two of them documenting a man across time. He laughed when she insisted on a second portrait and said he did not think he had improved with age, and she told him with complete honesty that he was wrong. She was 41 when she finished that second portrait, and her hands knew the brush the way hands know things learned through decades of devoted practice, and the work was better than it had ever been, more precise and more alive at once, the paradox of matured skill. She sent 3 paintings to a gallery in New York in 1901, at the invitation of a curator who had seen her work in a Texas exhibit in Austin, and all 3 sold to private collectors within the first week of the showing, which she found gratifying in a dry and satisfied way. Oliver took her out to dinner at Mrs. Torr's eating house to celebrate, which was now run by Mrs. Torr's daughter-in-law since the elder Mrs. Torr's had retired, but the tamales were unchanged, and the establishment still had the same warm, busy atmosphere of the place where they had first eaten together in the bright Saturday afternoon of the first summer. They sat across from each other at the same table, probably, and drank good coffee and ate tamales, and were entirely comfortable and entirely glad of each other in the way that people are who have built something real over a long time and who know, with the knowledge that comes not from certainty but from lived experience, that it is the right something. On the way home in the wagon under the stars, the same enormous Texas stars she had written to him about from San Antonio, the stars that had been overhead on the December bridge, she leaned against his shoulder and listened to the mare's steady hoofbeats on the road and felt the thing she had learned over the years to recognize as contentment, which was not the same as happiness because it was quieter and deeper and more durable. "Oliver," she said, "I still think about the first morning I rode out to the ranch." He turned his head slightly toward her. "What about it?" "I thought I was going to the ranch to get a commission, and I got one, but that was the smallest thing I got." He said nothing for a moment. The wagon moved through the dark, the ranch lights visible ahead in the distance, the same red soil country on either side even in the dark, the specific smell of it that she had come to know as the smell of home. "What was the largest thing?" he asked. "You know what the largest thing was," she said, and she could feel him smile in the dark. "I do," he said, "but I want to hear you say it." She laughed the laugh that had always been entirely her own, direct and unguarded, the laugh he had learned to reach for in their earliest weeks together and had never stopped finding precious, and she said, simply, exactly, "You. It was always going to be you." The mare carried them home through the spring-smelling Texas night, and the ranch lights grew closer with each hoofbeat, and inside the house were 20 years of built life. The paintings on the walls, the portraits in the hallway, the studio with its Prussian blue stripe along the top of the north wall, the enormous kitchen table where the hands still ate and where James and Clara had grown up, and where Captain the Tortoise had once walked across a Sunday dinner table to the complete astonishment of a visiting minister. Outside were the east pastures with their red soil and the creek that ran in the spring, and the fence lines that they had fixed and mended and maintained, and the land that Oliver had stopped at and known, before he understood why, was where he was supposed to be, and she was with him. She had ridden out with a portfolio and a set of brushes and a belief about open sky, and she had found the open sky and the commission and the man who watched thunderstorms from the porch, and she had painted his father's face from grief and memory and love, and in doing so had built something that neither of them had known to expect and both of them had recognized, when it arrived, as the truest thing. The wagon pulled into the yard. The stars were very bright. The mare slowed to a stop in front of the barn as she had done 1,000 times, and Oliver set the brake and climbed down and held up his hand to Sallie as she climbed down after him, a hand she had been taking for 20 years, a hand she took now with the same conscious pleasure she had taken it with on the bridge in the December dark of 1882. They walked to the porch together, and Oliver lit the lamp inside, and the warm light came out through the windows into the yard, and Sallie stood on the porch for a moment before going in, looking out at the east pasture darkness and the stars above the red soil country and the particular quality of the Texas night. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that some things do not require explanation. Some things you simply know. You ride toward them in the early morning on a borrowed horse with your brushes packed and your conviction intact, and you find what you were looking for, and it is more than you knew to ask for, and you spend the rest of your life being grateful for the road that brought you to it. She went inside and closed the door behind her, and the lamplight was warm, and Oliver was waiting.